I'm James Foster, Vice Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University, representing its Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP. I'm here with Sabina Alkire, Director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, in the Department of International Development of Oxford University. And along with our colleagues at the Human Development Report Office of the UNDP, we are pleased to offer today's presentation of the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index 2021, Unmasking Disparities, Ethnicity, Race, and Gender. This is presented jointly today by Sabina Alkire and Sophie Charlene Pete of OPHI and Yanchun Zhang and Heriberto Tapia of the HDRO. This report is hot off the press, having been just released last week, but today's presentation promises the greater depth level afforded by an academic venue. So audience, please do your duty and ask those tough questions. In just a moment, I'll ask Sabina to describe the series and introduce the other three speakers. But first, I'd like to express my appreciation to the many others behind the scenes who prepared this report or have otherwise contributed to today's event. Especially, we're grateful to Jakob Dirksen, Ricardo Nogales, and Emmeline Marcelin of OPHI for lining up the great series this term, with topics running the gamut from ethnicity and poverty, social protection, projections of poverty, geospatial analyses of poverty, and impact evaluation, all from the multidimensional perspective. This is one of several series produced by IIEP designed to facilitate nonpartisan discussion of key challenges in international economic policy. The current season began last month with Dr. Muhammad Yunus speaking in our Facing Inequality series on the 3 zeros of unemployment, carbon emissions, and poverty. On Friday the 15th, our China Conference series begins at 9:30 a.m. Eastern with Professor Bingjing Li of Hong Kong University asking the question, did US politicians expect the China shock? And on the 20th, our Envisioning India series continues with JP Morgan's Sajid Chinoy contemplating India's economy in a post-pandemic world. The next event in the current series will feature Cecilia Calderon discussing ethnic disaggregations of the global MPI. Same time, same place. For these and other events, check out the website, iiep.gwu.edu. And if you miss an event, you can catch up through the reruns on the YouTube channel, IIEP GW. Now, without further ado, let me turn it over to Sabina for her introductory remarks. Sabina.
Thank you so much, James. So I'm very grateful to everybody who is present in person and online for this really seminar on the Global MPI 2021. And our presentation will be as follows. I will just give the opening on the structure of MPI and some results on gender, handing over to Sophie Charlene Petty, who was the coordinator of the Global MPI from the OPHI side, and also was deeply involved in starting up the Changes Over Time series, as well as in coordinating the analysis of Global MPI and of changes over time with colleagues at HDRO this year. Then we will pass over to Yanchun Zhang at the Human Development Report Office, who leads their statistics department and was overseeing the entire event from the perspective of HDRO. And she will be presenting the key findings on ethnicity, which were vital this year and new in terms of unmasking disparities that are very policy relevant in our period. And then she will give the floor to Heriberto Tapia, the head of research in Human Development Report Office, who is the pivotal person from their side in analyzing COVID data using micro post-pandemic high-frequency survey data for 45 countries and overlaying this with MPI data. So that's the structure of our event this today. And I thank all of our colleagues for this participation. So with that, I will start a very basic introduction. So the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index 2021, as James mentioned, focuses on unmasking disparities by gender and ethnicity and caste. and this need to unmask disparities, to look at inequities within countries and among subpopulations is very important. It links to the Sustainable Development Goals focus on leaving no one behind. And it also is new, and we'll mention some of the methodologies that are in use underlying this work. So first, I'd like to begin with a thank you. This is the work of over 25 people with as many skill sets in HDRO and in OPHI, and their creativity, their determination and enthusiasm and dedication and competence are really unparalleled. So this is a teamwork, a team effort, and I'm grateful to all of them for the part that they played in this product, because no one could do this alone. So first, an introduction to the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index. It covers 109 countries and 5.9 billion people this year, using as close as we can get to a standard measuring rod. So there are 3 dimensions: health, education, and living standards, and 10 indicators. You are deprived in nutrition if nobody in your household is, if anybody in your household is undernourished. And in child mortality, if a child sadly died in the last 5 years. If nobody in the household has completed 6 years of schooling, you're deprived. And if any child is not attending school up to the age at which they would complete class 8, if you cook with solid cooking fuel, if you have inadequate sanitation or if it is shared, if you have unsafe drinking water or it's 30 minutes or more away, you're deprived. If you lack electricity or good quality housing materials, or if you don't have at least 2 of a set of assets: radio, television, telephone, refrigerator, animal cart, computer, bicycle, motorcycle. And if you have a car or truck, you're not deprived in assets. So what do we do with this information? It's based on a counting approach, which looks at each household and the deprivations that they experience. So the specific indicator deprivations for living standards are at the household level, whereas for the education and the nutrition, we use information of individuals within the households that will later unpack in the gender analysis. And we aggregate it within the household to see if anybody is undernourished, if any child is out of school, if nobody has completed 6 years of schooling. So just to give you an example, and this comes from Beverlyn, who completed the MPhil in Development Studies in this course. This is an example from South Sudan of a woman who fled the conflict to Uganda with her 9-year-old granddaughter. And her deprivation profile is this. So she has not completed 6 years of schooling, and her granddaughter is out of school. They cook with firewood, like all in their settlement. Their latrine is shared with 8 families. Their drinking water is from a borehole that's more than 30 minutes walk away. They have electricity through a solar panel, but their house has a dirt floor, and their only asset of that list is a cell phone. Of course, it doesn't tell the whole story of their lives, but it gives a little bit of an insight into the different deprivations they face at the same time. According to this index, Nyawala is poor because she's deprived in 61.1% of the indicators. The indicators have weights, and the weights are equal across each dimension and equal across the indicators within each dimension. And if anybody has deprivations that equal or exceed 33%, they're identified as poor. And if it's 50% or more, they're severely poor. So that's how we define and identify a person as poor, which is very important in a multidimensional sense. And then we use this information to create an information platform. So it has the incidence or the percentage of people who are poor because they're deprived in at least 1/3 of the weighted indicators. And then it has the average deprivation score across the poor. For Nyawala, it was 61.1%. But across all poor people together, what is that? It shows how bad poverty is. 90% is worse than 40%. And then we can also examine the composition by indicator. because the MPI is both the product, meaning you multiply the incidence times the intensity and you get the MPI. But you can make the same number a different way. You can multiply the percentage of people who are poor and deprived in each indicator by the weight of that indicator, and then the next indicator up to the 10, and then you get the MPI, which means it can be broken down by indicator and show where actions need to focus to reduce poverty. It is also as a group of measures that extend the Foster-Thorbecke class of poverty measures. It is subgroup consistent and can be decomposed by any population groups for which the survey are representative. And my colleagues will be showing this shortly. So what do we use as the ingredients to cook the MPI? It's the demographic and health surveys for 45 countries, multiple indicator cluster surveys for 51 countries, and national surveys for 13. The data sets are from 2009 to 2019-20, and this year there are updated data for 21 countries and new estimates for Cuba and Tonga. And our data set on the websites all covers the national figures. And in the OPHI website, we have disaggregations by different topics, and we all cover the ethnic disaggregations. So, I will turn over at this point to Sophie, but I don't have the gender findings, so I come back later? Mm-hmm. Okay, over to you, Sophie.
Thanks so much, Sabina, and thanks for that introduction. And yeah, exactly. So we'll go through gender, COVID, and ethnicity right after we get started with the key findings, which are, oh, thank you. Okay, so the key findings for global. So we kind of have two questions here. We're looking at the question of who are these 1.3 billion multidimensionally poor people, where do they live, as well as what are those, what deprivations is that population experiencing? So what we found is some of our key findings have been consistent with other global MPI findings, which is about half are children. So those are about 644 million are people who are under the age of 18. That's 1 in 3 children who are multidimensionally poor compared to the adult figure, which is 1 in 6. And then we also break it down for the elderly population, so age 60 or over, which is about 8.2% of the multidimensionally poor population. Additionally, nearly 85% of those people are living in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Furthermore, we see about 1.1 billion, so that's about 84%, who are living in rural areas. So a lot of the population that we're covering here, who are multidimensionally poor by our measure, is in fact rural, rural poverty. We also find pretty interestingly that actually, although we talk about this measure as covering 109 developing countries, it's equally true that about 67% of the population that we cover are living in middle income countries. But what's interesting about that finding is that actually the range of incidence, so the range of how many people in the population are multidimensionally poor, really varies among those countries. So anywhere from 0.1% to around 2/3 of those populations of those countries. And subnationally, we see that range get even bigger. So subnationally, in some countries, it's 0%, and in others, it's nearly 90. Though obviously, that's pretty unlikely that that would be in the same country, but that's covering all 109. So in terms of the deprivations that these poor people face, so again, there's about, starting at the bottom, there's about 1 billion people who each are exposed to solid cooking fuels, inadequate sanitation, substandard housing. So, and then about 788 million living with somebody who's undernourished. 568 million are lacking improved drinking water within a 30-minute round trip. 635 million are living in households where no one has completed primary education. I mean, these are big, big numbers, which is one of the advantages we have of the global MPI, being able to cover a population of that size. Looking at the MPI and its comparison, or like a sister measure of monetary poverty. So one of the other kind of popular measures of poverty is looking at the $1.90 a day headcount measure, which is provided by the World Bank. And what we've done here is we've compared for the countries for which that data is available, the incidence of monetary poverty, so that's the $1.90 a day measure, to the incidence of both multidimensional poverty, which is that households where it's 1/3 or more of the weighted deprivations, as well as those in severe multidimensional poverty. And those are the households for which it's 50% or more of the equally weighted deprivations. So you can see that there's quite a lot of variation. I hope that you can see from the video, though I'm not sure. The purple bars, the purple bar is the incidence of multidimensional poverty. The blue bar is severe, and these little anchor guys are the $1.90 a measure. And so what's really important and interesting is that while there is some overlap, or sometimes the $1.90 a measure does look similar to the incidence of multidimensional poverty in some countries, there are plenty of cases where that's not true. So for example, in Pakistan, we see that using the most recent data, which I think is 2018, is only 4.4% of the population are living in monetary poverty, or the households living on less than $1.90 a day, where actually we see that as nearly 40% who are multidimensionally poor according to our measure. But then you also see the opposite, where in South Africa, you see it's about 19% of people, or 19% of the population is living in monetary poverty. But according to our measure, the multidimensionally poverty incidence figure is lower at around 6%. So it's important to compare these two together, and because they're measuring different things and they're both giving us important information about poverty. So one of the particular advantages, we think anyway, of measuring poverty with the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index is that you can break it down by indicator, as Sabina was saying. Just a bit more of the key findings of kind of the overall population. We saw that looking at trends, because one of the other things that we've done this year is compared trends across countries for multidimensional poverty, not just for one period of time and a second, but for a third, multi-wave analysis. So we saw that of the 80 country study, which have at least 2 points in time, which covers about 5 billion people, that 70 of those countries experienced a statistically significant reduction, but the patterns there were really interesting. So in Central African Republic and Guinea, for example, in their later surveys showed an increase in MPI value between the two most recent periods. And I'll talk about some of those differences in a second. But other trends that we found was that of the 20 countries that reduced their MPI value the fastest, 14 of them were in Sub-Saharan Africa, 3 in South Asia, 2 in East Asia and the Pacific, and 1 in Latin America and Caribbean. And the 4 fastest countries for which we saw poverty reduction levels was Sierra Leone, which actually that period was covering the Ebola epidemic, as well as Togo, Mauritania, and Ethiopia. And then for 23 countries, we saw they had reductions significant in all indicators among the multidimensionally poor, which is really fantastic. So again, when I was talking about that breakdown a little bit more, we saw that actually we had 24 countries where there was no statistically significant reduction among children, which is a particularly stark and striking finding, I think. And actually, again, in Central African Republic, covering the last 10 years, we saw a statistically significant increase among the child population, which is a really important, I think, finding and sobering for when we're looking especially at the post-pandemic world, where a lot of children are suffering from school closures and that sort of thing. So this is already where the state of the world where we are. We saw in 20 countries, the MPI value among children did not fall at all or fell more slowly than among adults during at least one period. Similarly, 13 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, 1 in the Arab states. We saw actually that the number of multidimensionally poor people increased. So again, the absolute number of people, even though there was a decrease in the incidence. And what we're seeing with trends like that is population growth. And so it's always important when we're looking at these trends to kind of keep that into account. And lastly, on the kind of overall trends that we saw that there were still in many regions, subnational regions that is, pro-poor reductions, where we saw that actually these regions were initially the poorest region in their country, but they reduced poverty faster than the national average, which is particularly fantastic. And important because what it does is it's a nod to that Leave No One Behind pledge, which is so central to Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. And 4 of those regions that we noted here were North Central in Liberia, Province 2 in Nepal, Sylhet in Bangladesh, and Tambacounda in Senegal. And lastly, before I turn it over to Sabina again for gender, just quickly here, one of the really fantastic additions that we had as this part of the report, or it's the report this year, was these multi-wave analyses. Because what it showed us actually was that there was a lot of variation in different countries' poverty reduction trends over time. So I've highlighted 3 here, which I think are particularly useful examples. There's the Central African Republic, which from between 2000 and 2010, statistically significantly reduced poverty. But actually, in the wake of kind of violent conflict in the country around the region, there was an increase between 2010 and 2018. In Nepal, you see that actually you had between the 2 time periods, there were similar rates of reduction, but actually the different indicators were really different. So the composition of how poverty reduced looked different according to the 2 time periods. And lastly, Gambia, where you saw that actually in the 2nd period, there was a much greater rate of reduction. So I'll pass to Sabina now, who'll talk to you about gender.
So of those 1.3 billion people who were poor, we wanted to know how many of them did not have an educated girl or woman, that is a girl or woman who had completed 6 years of schooling. And we found that 2/3, 836 of them, did not have an educated woman at home. That's quite a sobering finding when we think of how high profile girls' education and women's empowerment is in our discourse. We also found that 215 million poor people, 1 in 6, lived in a household where a boy or man had completed 6 years of schooling, but a girl or woman had not. And this varied, of course, by region. So that's one of the findings which brings together a gender lens and an intra-household lens to try to blend the household data with more fine and granular data. It's a new methodology, and you'll see more of this in weeks to come. And we also looked at female-headed households, and 108 countries are disaggregated by gender of the household head. And we found, again, 1 in 6 MPI poor people live in female-headed households. So the report covers them. So I now turn over to our colleague Yanchun Zhang in New York.
Thank you very much, Sabina. Thanks, James. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here joining OPHI colleagues to give this joint presentation on our joint Global 2021 MPI Report. It has been the 4th year we joined to produce the Global MPI Estimates, and 3rd year we joined to produce this Global MPI Report. Then the collaboration model between UN agency like UNDP and academic institution like OPHI, in our view, really help produce rigorous data, stats, and research for policymakers in the developing countries. We appreciate the teamwork and collegiality of OPHI colleagues. Look forward to strengthening this collaboration between us in the years to come. So let me start with the last slide on gender and IPV. Continuing with what Sabina presented in the report's gender section, we look at how multidimensional poverty is correlated with one of the common forms of violence against women and girls, which is intimate partner violence. Then from this graph, you can see there's a positive correlation between these 2 variables, which means women and girls living in multidimensional poverty are at high risk of intimate partner violence, often because they face uncertain living conditions and have less financial independence and bargaining power within the household. Next slide, please. So the focus of my presentation today actually is on the ethnicity section of the report based on ongoing research conducted by my colleague Cecilia and OPHI colleagues Sabina and Fanny. Cecilia, as mentioned by James, Cecilia will make a much more elaborated presentation on the ethnicity study at the seminar later this semester. Today, I will just present some key results and messages we include in the global report. As we know, we need disaggregate data to identify who is catching up and who is being left behind to reveal deprivations and disparities that may be hidden in the aggregated data. Then, as Sabina mentioned, we have done disaggregation in terms of subnational regions, urban versus rural areas, age groups, and this year in terms of the gender of household heads. So a new disaggregation we are exploring together this year is the MPI estimates by ethnic racial groups in 40 countries where we have the information, and by castes in India. It is important to acknowledge that the concept of ethnicity or race or ethnic group is incredibly varied across countries. Plus, survey instruments and sampling procedures are usually not sufficiently inclusive. So caution is needed to interpret these results. In total, in our new study, we cover 2.4 billion people and 291 ethno and racial groups and 5 caste groups. Next slide, please. Sorry, we misplaced some slides here. Can we go to past this? Yeah, here, thank you. So our estimates revealed that disparities in multidimensional poverty among ethnic groups around the world are quite wide. You can see we have the MPI values varying from 0.000 to 0.700, which is wider than across all 109 countries and all other disaggregations mentioned earlier. Even within countries, the disparity also quite wide. Within country disparities varies from less than 1 percentage point in some countries like Cuba, Kazakhstan, and Trinidad Tobago to more than 70 percentage points in countries like Gabon and Nigeria. Then some ethnic groups have a very high percentage of multidimensionally poor population. We find 128 million people belong to the ethnic group in which 70% or more of the population is multidimensionally poor. Then in the 9 poorest groups, or in 2 African countries, Burkina Faso and Chad, in these 9 poorest ethnic groups, more than 90% of the population is multidimensionally poor. Next slide, please. Then which ethnic groups are poorest and how? In the report, we also look at some regional pictures. Then data reveals that ethnic minorities in some East Asia and the Pacific countries experienced higher levels of multidimensional poverty. For example, in Vietnam, shown on this graph, ethnic minorities account for about 14% of total population, but nearly half of the multidimensionally poor people. So data reveals a similar picture in Lao PDR and also in Mongolia. Next. So this slide shows you some findings from the Latin American countries. We find indigenous peoples are found to be the poorest in some of the 11 Latin American countries covered in our study. By the way, today is Indigenous Peoples Day in the United States, so it's a quite nice coincidence. In one of these 7 countries, we find Bolivia. In Bolivia, indigenous people account for about 44% of the total population, but 75% of people living in multidimensional poverty. Additional information emerged from data. The incidence of multidimensional poverty, for example, varies across indigenous groups in Bolivia, ranging from 10% among the Amaya group to around 20% for the Quechua group and other indigenous group. Next slide, please. Here, let's take a look at Africa. A very interesting example is from Gambia. Our report finds that some ethnic groups could share similar MPI values, but face very different deprivations that make up multidimensional poverty. Then the policy implication might be we need differentiated anti-poverty policy actions to help these ethnic groups. For example, the Wolof and the Sarahu, the 2 poorest ethnic groups in Gambia, have roughly the same MPI values, but very different composition of their multidimensional poverty. On this slide, you can see that the Sarah who are more deprived in indicators such as nutrition, child mortality, school attendance, and cooking field, while the Wolof group face higher deprivations in indicators including years of schooling and the other 5 standard of living indicators. Next slide. So here is the slide, last slide from me, which is on India. In India, instead of ethnicity or racial group, we are looking at the caste and tribes because these are a more prevalent line of social stratification in India. Then 5 out of the 6 multidimensional people we find live in households whose head is from lower tribes or caste, which are either from the scheduled tribe or the scheduled caste or other backward class. Now in India, the scheduled tribe is the poorest group. More than half of them live in multidimensional poverty, followed by 33% of the scheduled caste group and 27% of our other backward class group. Now I hand over to my colleague, Heriberto. Heriberto's slides is before. Yeah, thank you so much, Sabina.
Thank you, Yanchun, and thank you, colleagues in OPHI. Thank you to colleagues attending the meeting virtually and in different parts of the world. So one of the limitations of the MPI data we're presenting this year is that it is pre-COVID data, the computations of the MPI, and this is due to the availability of data, and it's going to take a while until we can capture the effect of COVID on people. So what we did this year, working together with the colleagues in office, was to try to learn as much as possible about the multidimensional effects of COVID in the lives of people. So in order to do this, we overlay the data coming from the MPI with a high frequency phone surveys conducted by the World Bank during the pandemic. So this doesn't have a global coverage, but it has a very interesting coverage of 45 countries. This is actual data, and this is not simulations like others are doing, and it is from different developing regions. Something important in this study is that there is a particular focus on the poorest countries in the world, which are typically absent in many other studies, and certainly they are typically absent from the headlines that are related to COVID. Most of them focus on developed countries, Europe, the US, Latin America. There is very little about what's happening with the poorest countries, and this sample captures around 60% of the people living in low human development countries and around 60% of the people living in sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please. So what we document through this analysis is that there are large multidimensional effects among the poorest countries in the world that are linked to the COVID-19 pandemic. So here you see that in terms of education, the percentage of households with children who stopped participating in formal education, so children that didn't have any opportunity to interact with a teacher during the pandemic, is way larger in the poorest countries. This might not look surprising. However, what is very important to have in mind are the orders of magnitude. So you can see that in most of the countries, the order of magnitude is over 50%. And in some countries, this magnitude is over 80 or even 90%. So this is a big problem affecting children. And what is crucial is that the effects of these are long lasting. Something that comes out of this analysis is that there is a space for policy. So countries at different, at all levels of development, there are countries that did better than others. So this analysis shows that policies matter. In this study, we didn't include a comprehensive set of dimensions. However, we thought that this was representative of things that were happening also in other dimensions that we cover, but are not included in this publication. So, for instance, what is happening with food security. Next slide, please. So, a pattern here is that countries with higher MPI, so countries that are poorer multidimensionally, are both more vulnerable and also with a more limited ability to respond to the shocks. So when it comes to the emergency social protection, for instance, and this is the figure that we are showing in this slide, the coverage during the COVID-19 period is way less prevalent in countries with high levels of multidimensional poverty. So precisely the countries that need the most are the ones that have a more limited capacity to respond. So, and this is certainly linked in with the need of the countries are linked to certain vulnerabilities. So, for instance, in terms of the percentage of workers that are in informality, here we are capturing these proxies with the percentage of employed non-wage workers. So here we have a very bad combination that can create poverty traps going forward. So finally, a reflection about the meaning of this building back better. We have been talking about this since the beginning of the pandemic. This is an opportunity, but we see that in many countries, in particular countries that are not in the headlines, countries that are in the poorest region of the world, we have a problem that is gonna stay. So therefore, the challenge for us as a researchers and working together with OPHI is to, over the next months, to be able to pin down in a more detailed way the effects of the pandemic on these countries. The world today is reaching the highest level of GDP per capita in history. So there are many variables that are recovering. The stock markets are recovering, but we see that here there are very concerning signals about what is happening in the lives of people. So I'm gonna stop here, and I'm just gonna go over the very last slide. So to close the presentation, to let you know that this is just a relatively brief view of all the work that we have done. There are plenty of documentations that is a result also of the accumulated work of years in terms in our websites, both in OPHI and HDRO website. Please go there. You can find the data. You can find the codes to compute what we did in the report. So please take a time, because I think this is a very important resource. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Great. Sabina, are you there? Well, while we wait for Sabina to come on board, allow me to refer you to the chat where I've asked folks to put in questions into the Q&A functionality of Zoom, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Sabina for on-site questions.
Are there any questions from the room?
Anyone? While it's the online audience still has time to reflect and put their questions in the Q&A box. Anyone here?
I mean, if you're going to be so slow, I'll have to chime in myself.
Go ahead, James.
Great. My question for Sabina and party would be, it's kind of a big overview question. It's one I love to think about when we have a new report come along. You've seen a lot of data over the years, 10 years, 12 years of reports. And what you've compared to what you've seen over the years, what is it that really stood out, say in the last report or even the last plus the previous report, as to something that appears to be different, that appears to be going on new here? That's one of my questions. And then link what Heriberto just said to that big long-term picture and tell us what we have, on the other side of this pandemic, if you can. Very small questions.
And I'll take a first stab and then my colleagues will figure out the real answer. So I think that one thing that's changed clearly are the data. So when we launched in 2010 with data from 2000 to 2010, including the 2003 World Health Survey, there was a lot less comparability between the surveys, and there was a lot more disparity in terms of the dating. And even though these data are pre-pandemic, 22 countries have data to 2019 or 2019-20, and 79 countries home to 84% of the poor have data from 2015 or later. So the data are more up to date. Furthermore, they're more comparable. So the DHS and mixed questions share a common sampling frame. And so our ability to harmonize and do trends over time is much easier now because of the new data measures that are agreed between two of our major data sources. So I think that's one major change. And I think associated with that, our ability to look not only at level of poverty, but at trends across those 80 countries is a real step forward. And to have 3 periods of 28 countries this year means that we can start to understand a little bit more about the trends. And when we have the post-pandemic data, that'll get stronger. So that is one thing that makes it very exciting. And then behind the scenes, there's also the fact that now we are running a toolbox that Nikolai Sapa made with Ushika Nagaratnam of SATA programs. And so it means that the workload and the work line of the global MPI is harmonized in a way it wasn't when we began with lots of loops in Stata. So that's invisible to this kind of presentation, but it changes and it makes work like disaggregation possible with an accuracy that maybe we can have confidence in. But others have probably the better answers. So over to Sophie and then any others.
Yeah, I would just second what Sabina said about trends, because we released for the first time at mass scale with the global MPI trends last year, but having the multi-wave period, I think, is really important for different types of analyses that are going to be made possible by having those different cross-sectional time series.
Yanchun or Harry, do you have things to add?
Yes, very, very briefly. I was very new to this MPI report production, but I noted there's a great country coverage improvement over even the last couple of years. Then when the first report was produced, the report covers 101 developing countries. Then the following year, 107, then this year 109. Then in particular, in terms of trend analysis, the first year we only had 10 developing countries included in the trend analysis. The following year already increased to 75, and this year 80 countries. Not only in terms of the country coverage, but also in terms of waves. This year we will manage to cover 3 waves for quite a few number of the countries. So I think in terms of data availability, definitely we have seen the improvement over time. Then that will that has make the report richer and also provide more insights on the evolution of MPI over time, but also across countries. Harry, do you have anything to add?
Just a quick comment. I think I fully agree. So this is a great moment after the improvement over years, but at the same time, and this is coming back to the James question, it's a moment when the world is changing. So I think we need the responsibility to leverage all this learning, all this capacity to now try to make an additional effort to try to capture the new trends. COVID is one of them, but there are others. So hopefully we can now double down on these improvements and push the frontiers in the next months and years. Over.
Great. Well, we have a question online. Actually, I'll combine 2 if you don't mind. From one of our attendees in the audience, virtual audience. Thank you for the thorough presentation. It's greatly appreciated. I wanted to inquire about overlaps between the ethnic groups. As you said, caution is required due to the definitions of ethnic groups, how they vary worldwide. In Paraguay, the MPI's defined ethnic groups would be labeled by the language they speak. Here, it seems that there could be a huge overlap between speakers of languages. How might we proceed, given that there seems to be no clearly defined groups in this case, as people may fall under 2 or more? How might the measure over time take into consideration those who acquire languages and therefore by definition change ethnic group? And then from Samuel McQuillan, we have a short question. Do we have any data regarding how COVID-19 heterogeneously impacted ethnic groups or female-headed households? Over.
So I can take a stab at the ethnicity question. We are users of data sets that exist. And so when we decided to disaggregate, we had the criteria that the question had to be in the survey, DHS or mixed. And furthermore, the survey report itself had to disaggregate by that variable so that those who created the survey and did the sampling frame believed it was representative by those groups. Paraguay is the only country that uses language, but the groups that we disaggregate by are mutually exclusive. So it is the primary language. That is not ideal. And there are many things that are not ideal. Countries have different numbers of ethnic groups. And so the disparity might be a function of the number of ethnic groups that are reported. They are self-reported. So maybe there are incentives to report one because you might get some benefit. So in some surveys, we only have data of the ethnicity of the household head or of a particular woman. In others, we have it for all household members, but we had to have a way of systematizing it for the household. So the paper, which will be forthcoming with Fanny Covesti and Cecilia Calderon, will go into all of these issues and also robustify, will basically crank the numbers for different definitions of ethnicity because it's imperfect. We know it's imperfect, but it's too important to ignore. And so we're trying to figure out very carefully what we can do with the data that exists and share some of these information. So thank you for the question. I'll turn over to somebody else in terms of COVID impacts on female-headed households or ethnic groups.
On that question, so we are constrained by data. So there are some countries that are starting to produce some data that allow the analysis of these groups. So one of them is Brazil. So actually we commissioned a paper analyzing precisely also the intersectionality of this group. So what happens with the females that that are of certain ethnic groups. So however, this is available only for effects in the labor market. So I think we need to wait until we have more information from more surveys in order to produce something that we can integrate into the multidimensional poverty machinery. So, but there are some surveys, and if the person who is asking about the question write me an email, I can send the paper to he or her. Over.
Maybe
Fantastic. Go ahead, Yanchun.
Thanks, James. Maybe add two small things here on ethnicity to answer the question. In the report, we used the Paraguay's 2016 a mixed survey. So as Sabina said, in the survey, it asked the head of the household, what's the primary language you are speaking? So given the data constraint, that's what we are using the survey data to review the ethnicity disparities. Then going forward, we will have to consider whether we can find a way of addressing the overlapping ethnic self-identification later. Now on COVID, maybe one thing to emphasize here is the data, the survey data we use to calculate the MPI estimates, including all this disaggregated MPI estimates, are pre-COVID data. Then the COVID section in the report used the World Bank's high-frequency phone interview data. So these are the different source of data. So that's why it doesn't provide the ethnicity disaggregation information or gender disaggregation information as in the other parts of the report. Thank you.
That makes sense. Thanks a lot. Yes, let's turn it over to Sabina in house at Oxford for a question among her curious, captive audience.
One question.
Yes, please go ahead.
More of a clarification. There was a point that you made that there was no significant reduction in MPI amongst children, if I understood correctly.
In a share of the country. So not, so in many countries, there was a significant reduction in children, but I think it's about a third, right?
So in 24 countries, there was zero reduction of poverty among children. And then in a total of 38 countries, either there was zero reduction among children, or there was a significant reduction among children, but it was slower than adults. So children are being left behind. So that's how those both figures come together. So 20 countries, it was either zero or positive, but it was slower than adults.
I just wanted to know, because I thought the MPI was measured for households. So is there like a separate measure just for children?
So the tables of the global MPI are disaggregated by rural urban areas, by subnational regions, and by age cohorts and gender of the household head. So all those disaggregations are online. So we took the children's aspect of children being 0 to 17 and analyzed that. Two more questions this side, James, okay?
Sure enough, I'll let you go with one and then I'll take the next.
Okay.
Kind of piggybacking off of hers, do you know that for the people whose numbers haven't changed, for those children in that scenario, with the multidimensional poverty index, did it stay the same across all the individual factors within it? Or was there something to where one thing that was worse got better, but something that they were better, that they had better frequencies that got worse? So it looks overall like it didn't change, but the nuances within it were those the same?
No. So if you look at table 6, which is changes over time, and you click on the worksheet, which is about children or age disaggregations, and filter it for 0 to 17. If you go to the right-hand side, you see the censored headcount ratios. And what you'll see is that some of them have 2 or 3 stars. So they had significant reductions and others didn't, or they had small increases. So you can analyze that country by country. But it is exactly true that you said that the indicator movements for children varied across countries.
And that was my question as well. So.
Okay. Okay, we're good to go here, James.
Then we'll move on to the question of Elmond Bandauko. What is your reflection on multidimensional poverty in cities and your perspectives on the future? How does this vary in different regions based on this study? That's the question.
I can give a very quick answer, and then I'd love to hear from my colleagues as well. But this is where population growth is really important, because also in there's 2 regions that make up about 85% of the multidimensionally poor, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, are also home to cities with megacities of huge populations. So this is something that we're actively very interested in. But even still, we see that according to the measures in multidimensional poverty, that according to the measures of the global MPI, that even if you're in a city, it still might be more likely that you have access to electricity, for example, versus if you live in a much more geographically disparate area. So it is the case, of course, that there are more information that we are perhaps missing as a result of what the measure currently is in terms of its comparability across all 109 countries in all aspects of each country. But it is true that even still, the rural poor make up a much larger share of the multidimensionally poor.
And just to cap that a little bit, 55% of those 5.9 billion people live in rural areas, and 45% live in in urban areas. But 84% of the poor live in the rural areas. So in the rural areas, 1/3 of people are poor, and in the urban areas, it's 7.8%. Now, is that because the urban samples overlook the slums? Is that because they don't include the pavement dwellers, the homeless who might be in the cities? Possibly, well, certainly to some extent. Is that also because some of the indicators like rubbish disposal or overcrowding are not in the MPI because they might not be comparable across different countries? That too. So there is a need for better measures of urban poverty, but also for sampling unsampled populations, particularly in urban areas.
So I have a general question if no one else in the room is there. Is there someone with a question? Because I'll jump right in.
This one.
Yeah. Maybe I've mentioned it already, I'm not sure, but have you conducted an analysis of the effects of gender and ethnicity combined?
So shall we let Yanchun or Harry, do you want to answer that?
And if yes, what have been the findings?
So go ahead, Yanchun.
If I understand the question correctly, it's not related to the COVID. It's on the general disaggregation included in the report, right?
Yes.
Then we don't combine ethnicity and gender in the current report.
Reason? Why?
So why don't we do it? One is that what that would require is it would require you to cut the sample by ethnicity and gender. And so the sample size would go down. And we didn't have time or capacity to validate if it was still arguably representative. So without being able to do that very, very detailed work for every single country, you can't release those findings. So we will be trying to see how far we can go with the gender and intra-household work in terms of looking subnationally, but we don't yet know. So we're going one step at a time.
So I had just a basic question. It stems out of work, I guess. Did everyone, by the way, answer the questions on that? I jumped right in. Apologies. Everyone happy? Okay, then I'll pull back. Just a really basic question. On the result that 2/3 of folks don't have someone, female, who is adequately educated in the household, that would indicate a huge loss of capability in these poorer households. I'm wondering if you could go into the technology that you've used to find that, because that seems to be getting a degree of information that's one step further than you usually would have. And what is the technology you use to get that? And if you could go into some of the aspects of that technology for us here.
No, thank you so much. So behind the surveys, we have what's called the household roster, which is everybody who is a usual member of the household. And we have the years of completed schooling or the level of schooling that they've completed. And we know their gender. And gender is defined in a binary way in the surveys that we use. And so we can tell in each household, how many women are educated, how many men are educated by different levels. We chose 6 years of completed schooling for this study. And so we know if they're poor or not. And then we look inside the household and say, well, in which households is there a woman who's completed 6 years of schooling or a girl? So anybody who is eligible in terms of their age to be considered for that question. And we can see households in which 0 females. Now there's 16 million people who live in households without a woman. We're not looking at those. We're only looking in the households that have an eligible girl or woman. And then we find 836 million people live in households without an educated woman. And then we want to know about the boys and men. So then in the same microdata, we look at the boys and men and we say, how many households without an educated woman have an educated boy or man? And it's 215 million. And so the rest don't have an educated boy or man and don't have an educated girl or woman. And that's nearly half of the global MPI poor people. Just to put that in perspective, because it's a bit heartrending. So half of the people who are poor don't have any man or woman who has completed 6 years of schooling. And that's among 1.3 billion. If you look at the 4.6 billion people who are not poor, only 4.2% of them lack any educated man or woman or boy or girl in the household. So it's really a phenomenon of poverty. So that's what we're trying to do step by step, is go back to the microdata, but link it to this display of the 10 indicators we understand from the MPI. And so we can both have individual gendered intra-household relationships and a household-based MPI. Over.
Yes, questions there. Great, then I'll have a chance to interrogate just a little further. I really find that discussion to be fascinating, and it does ask a bunch of other questions, which would be in terms of other kinds of capabilities that people might have, where they're sort of isolated without having those capabilities, either themselves or people around them don't have those capabilities. Is there anywhere else that we can go for those sorts of results that you're seeing? Plus, I mean, if we had full network data, it may be that having people down the road that could help with the sorts of things that education conveys in terms of capability, that would be well enough potentially for certain types of things, not for others. So that calls into question the idea of actually having information on people's broader networks beyond households. So I'll just ask you those two general discussion points and ask you to riff.
Again, Yanchun or Harry, do you want to go first?
Maybe Harry can talk about enhanced capabilities. We have been talking a lot in our reports.
Yeah, so we are now precisely asking the question of how to measure the capabilities that are defining the lives of people. What defines the ability of people to fulfill their potential today, and because we realize that the agenda of the 20th century, even though it remains very important and crucial because it is unfinished, so at the same time there is a new agenda that depends on other things, and some of them are related precisely to the ability of people to interact with their environment. Internet connection, for instance, is something that becomes now critical in the context of COVID, and it's going to be even more important in the future. So, and this is crucial because now not having access to internet, for instance, it's even more damaging than not having access to internet just 2 years ago. So this is a very practical type of indicators that we should pay more attention to, but there are others. So I think this is a broad discussion that I think we need to collectively tackle, because things are changing and we need to update our measures. Over.
Yeah, just to add a little bit, conceptually, in the Human Development Report office here, we have been writing about distinguishing basic capabilities from enhanced capabilities in the last couple of reports. Then Herberto elaborated very well what enhanced capabilities we were thinking about, which we think very important for the citizens nowadays to fulfill their what they want to be, what the kind of life they want to lead. But back to metrics, back to data, back to stats, we are constrained by data. So this message was repeated a couple of times today. For example, in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of standard of living, these are the key dimensions we have been looking at in measuring human development. In terms of health, we try to incorporate healthy life expectancy to our index. Then in terms of education, we only have the length of education, you know, the mean year of schooling, expected years of schooling. But in terms of the quality of the education, we have not been able to find any good indicator to be incorporated in our index. Then Harry mentioned the impact of the environment, sustainability on our living standards. So these factors are very important, but constrained by data, or we are moving slowly in that direction because we also want to maintain the nice country coverage. For our work, it's very important to have a very decent size of country coverage. Then back to what Sabina explained earlier, why we didn't look at gender and ethnicity together, because for the ethnicity study, we so far we have had, we only had data for 41 countries. That's it. So so when you do this cross analysis, then you will face the reality. You probably see a very small sample. Thanks, James.
Just one more thing very quickly, if I might. I think there's a paper by some people called Basu and Foster. Don't know who those are. Anyway, they wrote a paper about the fact that if you have one educated person in the household, they often read for other members of the household. So it's often a household common good, as it were. Now, what James was saying, I think, if I understand it in my mind, is that if you have the primary sampling unit, you would be able to find out in that primary sampling unit how many people have educational capabilities or how many people have internet. So that would be one thing you could do. You could also merge, if you have geospatial location, you could merge PSUs and institutional data to know access to other kinds of services. But then you would have to also know something about sharing and caring, because you would be making a very strong assumption that if I can, I will help you. And we know humans, some of them do, some of them don't. And so we would need a separate set of analyses on who shares, and who might not share their capabilities. But I think that that's really interesting when we also think about collective goods and providing infrastructure and services to a community outpost rather than to each person individually, which is sometimes a lot more of an effective way of doing it. But we have to think each of those things through, both from a data side and from an actual human behavior side. Over.
Well, it appears that I'm over here. We have a paucity of questions. You've done too great of a job explaining to people what is going on. So I'm going to leave it to you folks in Oxford to close down today's session.
So thanks to everybody who's come here. Thank you so much to our colleagues, Yanchun Zhang and Heriberto Tapia, who presented this report with Sophie, Charlene Petty, and myself here, but also to all of our colleagues that have worked on this work. And really what Heriberto said at the end of the presentation is really what we want to leave you with, which is that these data are open source. A report goes nowhere to help the poor. It needs other people to engage it. It needs other people to say, what happened in my country? And then write a blog on it, post it, understand it, make a nice Instagram thing on it. Whatever your skills are and interests are, that's what will take this work to the next stage. And the only reason we do this work is not to have a study, but so that it will serve the people whose difficult situations are profiled, and also to critically engage where it has oversights, where it needs to go a step further in terms of analysis. So we hope that people will visit the resources online and take that extra step forward. Thank you so much.
And thank you from DC, from New York, and from Oxford. See you next time.